Well, you read the title. I'm going to be showing you all the CDs I've collected over the years. Some of you may remember that I made a CD collection video back in early 2020. I've bought some more since then, so I figured now would be as good a time as any for an update. However, instead of just showing you the stuff I picked up since 2020, I've decided to redo the entire collection video from scratch. This is because the original video was admittedly on the messy side. For instance, I went through the CDs in a seemingly random order. The audio quality could have been better. The way I shot it was inconsistent, and my commentary wasn't great. I'll still be keeping that version public, and I think that video is decent overall despite my issues with it, but I feel I've gotten better at recording voiceovers and presenting myself since then. Anyway, you've probably noticed that this video is called My CD Collection instead of My CD and Vinyl Collection. This is because I haven't bought any more vinyl records since posting the original video. In fact, I actually sold my record player along with some of the vinyls I showcased a while ago. The ones I didn't sell I returned to their original owners, since some of those weren't actually my own. However, I do still have these 4 vinyl records. Boom Smack The Anarchist Songbook, Rhythm Heritage Last Night on Earth, Saturday Night Live self-titled, and Tracks of the Vinyl Dogs. Anarchist Songbook is a really nice hip-hop album. It's mostly instrumental, but there are a few vocal cuts. Last Night on Earth is a solid disco album. Saturday Night Live is a cool French house EP. The 4th track on it, Master Flashback, is pretty much a house cover of The Message by Grandmaster Flash. And Tracks of the Vinyl Dogs is a pretty neat collection of instrumental hip-hop tunes. All of them are pretty simplistic and really repetitive, but they're still kind of cool. I also thought that the vocal intros were a nice touch. The only reason I know this exists is because Fatboy Slim sampled the vocal intro of the first track, and the only reason I know this exists is because it was released on the same label as this. So, that's that. If I'm being honest, I'm not really into vinyl records. They certainly look cool, but as far as actually listening to music, I'd rather just stream it, download it, or get a CD. Anyway, let's talk about those CDs. The vast majority of the music I listen to falls under electronic, so that's what most of my collection consists of. I'll be going through these in alphabetical order. If I have more than one album or other type of release from a given artist, I'll go through their stuff chronologically. Ordinarily, I'd start with numbers, but I don't actually have anything from an artist whose name starts with a number. I have considered getting a copy of 808 State's Quadrastate before, since it's the only project of theirs that's not on streaming services, but yeah, that's not gonna happen. But I digress. Let's start with the A's. First up, I got the debut EP/compilation from Air, Premier Symptoms. Now, Air is one of my all-time favorite bands. I think pretty much all of their albums are great. Sadly, they haven't done much since 2014, but the 2 members have released some solo material that I also really like. But getting back to Premier Symptoms, I'd say this is my #1 favorite EP from any artist. All 5 tracks here are excellent. Each one is super colorful, dazzling, and easy to sink myself into. The version I own is the 1999 reissue that adds 2 bonus tracks, California and Breaks On. Those are both solid cuts, even if I don't like them as much as the original 5 tracks. Regardless, this is definitely worth a shot if you haven't heard it already. I also have their debut album, Moon Safari. This is my favorite album from them, although 10,000 Hertz Legend is a very, very close second. This continues the style explored on Premier Symptoms, but obviously further fleshed out. Once again, every single track here is fantastic. I got Alan Brack's The Uppercuts. This is the original version from 2005 and not the reissue that came out. I've listened to both versions, and I definitely prefer the original. The reissue feels a little overstuffed, though there are some cool exclusive cuts on that version. Anyway, this is a really nice collection of French house tunes with a good amount of variety. Some of the highlights here include In Love With You, Music Sounds Better With You, Intro, and Rubicon are all really great. When I first heard this comp, there was one track that I didn't really like, being Lincoln Rings. While pretty much everything else is in the dance/house vein, Lincoln Rings is just a straight rap song. Admittedly, it's pretty out of place. Not pretty, it's very out of place. But I grew to like it later on. That track was actually cut from the reissue alongside Vertigo for some reason, and I could understand why, well, for Lincoln Rings. But I don't mind its inclusion here. Up next we have Alex Gopher, Isiyun Gopher Party, baby? Yeah, this cover's weird. This wasn't his first proper release, but it was the first one he put out under the Alex Gopher name. This is another one of my favorite EPs. It's a jazzy trip-hop and breakbeat offering with a really dark and ominous atmosphere. The case I got for this is a little bit damaged, unfortunately. Ordinarily I would replace it, but this is those, the slim European cases, and I can't find those super easily. Next up, we got Alex Gopher and Demon presents Was, however you pronounce that. This is the one and only album they did together. I think Gopher and Demon made a great duo, as their production styles were easily compatible. This project isn't as well known as the other French house classics, but it's still a very strong album with its own feel. My favorite tracks on here are the more groove-centric ones, like the title track, Without You, Lose Me, and The Shell. There's some more laid-back cuts too, like Focus and The Dark Side, that I like too. My only real complaint with this album has to do with the final track. It's about 12 minutes long, and there's this weird 5-minute section towards the halfway point, but everything else is great. Up next, I got Arc with Q-Har, or however you say that. This is a short, little-known album from French producer Arc. I found out about Arc through his work in the short-lived project Tranquillou with Pepe Braddock. Anyway, despite being under 40 minutes, this album tries some cool things. There are some experimental moments, some minimalistic cuts, and some more dance-oriented material here. Yeah, quite a bit of variety. The best tracks here are Baby and Punkadelic. The former is a really smooth, deep house cut. Punkadelic, meanwhile, is a hard-hitting dance tune with a great bass line. Overall, not an amazing album, but a good one. Next up is Armand van Helden's To Future For You. Armand van Helden is an artist who I think is pretty inconsistent. He can definitely be hit or miss. But I would say this album is one of his more consistent offerings. I'm not a huge fan of Entra Mi Casa. That one's a little awkward to me. And the two interludes here don't really add anything. Said interludes are just recordings of phone calls. They probably could have just been removed. And like I said, they feel unnecessary. But everything else here ranges from good to great. There's quite a bit of variety here, and each cut manages to be pretty striking despite how simplistic some of them are. Some of the standouts include Psychic Bounty Killers, You Don't Know Me, and Open, and Summertime is a really nice one too. I got the first album from Bang Bang. This is a really nice down-tempo album with some with a jazz edge. Half the cuts here are vocal cuts and the other half are instrumental. There are definitely some moments here that hit more than others, but this is a really solid album overall. This is kind of a random note, but it's the intro to the second track on here. Whenever I hear it, it reminds me of the show Arthur, and I don't know why. Like, just the way it sounds, it makes me think of Arthur. Alright, I got the second album from Bang Bang, Silicone. Not as good as the first. I don't think the vocals are as good, nor are the tunes as memorable, but it's still a good album. This one has a greater focus on electronic textures. I got Bob Sinclair's Paradise album. I will not be showing the front of this because there's nudity, and I don't want this video to get removed or age restricted or whatever else. Despite the controversy surrounding the final track, Gym Tonic, this is one of my favorite albums, period. Like, it is a fantastic French house album. Tons of variety. Each track is very well produced, and the hooks are great. So if you're into that French house style like I am, definitely give this one a shot. I also got the My Only Love single. This is the version that has the radio edit, the Superfunk remix, and a non-album track called Rock Solid. All three tracks are very nice. I also like how the radio edit ends differently than the album version. I'm not really sure why it says special 12-inch disco version on here, but whatever. I got the second Bob Sinclair album, which I think is about on par with the first, maybe slightly weaker, but still excellent. This one has more of a overt disco flavor to it. Seems heavily inspired by the work of Sharon. It's a really solid album. Next up, I got BT's ESCM. ESCM stands for Electric Sky Church Music. This is the US version that has Lullaby for Gaia instead of The Road to Lost With Hell. And I believe it also has the alternate mix of Love, Peace, and Grease. Now, BT isn't an artist that I follow very closely, but he does have a handful of albums that I like, including this one. The only moment on here I'm not really a fan of is that one part in the middle of Solar Plexus where BT basically turns the song into like a grungy, emo, over-the-top rock thing. But this is still a really good album. Alright, up next I got another pretty obscure one in Bustafunk. This is a house album with some disco and funk flares to it. It kind of reminds me of Bob Sinclair's Champs LCs, which I just showed you. Also, like that album, it's primarily a vocal house album with a couple of instrumental cuts, most notably the first 3 tracks. I enjoy pretty much every single track on here, and I do think this album is kind of a hidden gem. The pop-leaning cuts like Addicted to You, Run Baby Run, and South Shore Drive are all really fun, as are the instrumental cuts. Of the instrumentals, I'd say my favorite is probably Mars, which is much darker than anything else on the album. It's got a mysterious, spacey kind of sound to it with those dark synths. Also, the cut To You goes super hard. One more thing is that when I first heard this album, there was a 30-second pause at the end of the final track, which made me think, is there going to be something hidden or something like that? I turned up my volume to see if maybe there was something super quiet in the mix, and then I heard this.
If you believe there's another song, well, you're wrong.
So that was kind of a jump scare. But regardless, really great album here. I got the debut album from Cassius, 1999. You'll never guess when this came out. I'll admit that I'm heavily biased because I didn't get to the others till later, but this is easily my favorite album from them. My favorite tracks on here are some of the more energetic and well-known ones, like Feeling For You, Foxy, New Life, etc. I have seen a few people call this album overhyped, but I have to disagree with that. It is very much one of the big French house classics. It may not be perfect, but I still really like it. I gotta replace this case since I don't like those broken teeth there. But I digress. May Philippe Zidar continue to rest in peace. Next up, I got Catalan FC with Respect Is Burning. This is the opening track on a compilation called Paris Is Sleeping, Respect Is Burning. I opted to get this instead of the compilation itself since the comp has a few too many tracks in common with stuff I already own. But honestly, I'm glad I sprung for this instead. It's got the shorter edit on the comp, the original mix, and then a cool remix from Les Rhythm Digital, who is actually Stuart Price. It was an alias he used. And it's also got 2 more cuts on it, Lil Longer and My Piano Bar, which are both pretty neat. Next up, I got one of the 2 unofficial things I own, Chemical Brothers, Live in Sweden 96, although this is a weird bootleg because the title is different on the spine, the front cover, and the disc, because here it says Live in Sweden 96. On the spine, it just says Live, and then the disc says On the Radio. I got this while I was in a record store on vacation, and I kind of just took a shot in the dark, because I thought it looked intriguing, and in 2022, I really got into the Chemical Brothers. They were actually my most streamed artist on Spotify that year. And I wanted something from them physically, but I don't think they had any of their actual albums. So I was like, what the heck, I'll just get this. The audio quality on the actual broadcast isn't great, unfortunately. In fact, it's honestly kind of poor. But, oh well. Next up, I got Chromeo, White Women. I got this a long time ago at a record store that I've only been to once. My favorite track on here, big surprise, is the opener, Jealous. But everything else is also pretty nice. I have Crydomore Presents Waves. Despite technically being a various artist comp, I have this one under the C's on my shelf. This is also the original version that doesn't have the in-flight Raw Club mix. I do actually prefer this version since it gives the track White Winds more room to breathe. But this is another early favorite of mine. Back when I was first getting into Daft Punk and I discovered the side projects, I came across this. And after giving it a listen, I loved pretty much all of it, except for the track Wet Indies, which I didn't really like, and to this day is an easy least favorite on this comp. But everything else ranges from good to amazing. I remember when I first heard the cut Spaced Out, when it got to that drop, my mind was blown. I also really like the artwork on this. Actually, I'm going to take out the booklet because one thing I really like about Crydomore, each individual track has its own artwork. But yeah, Crydomore was awesome. I still love the catalog of Crydomore tracks today. Let me get this out of the way. I also got the sequel, Waves 2. I think this one's a little harder to come by. I had a harder time finding this at a good price. The continuous mix on this one is not as good as the first, but the individual moments are still really good. I especially like Play Paul's contributions, since his single on Cry No More I think is probably my #1 favorite release on the label. Actually, I'm going to take out the booklet for this one too, because when I first went through it, there was something about it that kind of mystified me. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. I don't know if you can make that out. I hope the camera's in focus. But right here where my thumb is, it says Cry No More fucks the war. I don't really know what that means or what that's about, but that's a thing. Alright, next up, I got my CDs from Daft Punk. Now, if you somehow don't know already, Daft Punk are my favorite artists of all time. They're very formative to my taste in music, and I still love them to this day. I've of course made several videos about them over the years, and as such my love for them is already pretty well documented, but anyway, this is their debut album, Homework. Definitely a house music classic here. I didn't love the whole thing when I first heard it, but now I like pretty much all the tracks on it except for Rock and Roll. If it were up to me, I'd replace that track with their B-side to the defunct single, Music, but it is what it is. I've mentioned this before, but this was the first CD I ever bought, and thus the one I started my collection with. Is this album perfect? No, but it is still a great one. I got their first live album, Alive 1997. This is basically one balls-to-the-wall crazy 45-minute jam session. I haven't come back to this one as much as Homework, but I do still have a lot of fun with it anytime I put it on. I've read multiple sources that said this release isn't actually the full concert. In fact, it's actually less than half of the full concert. I'm not sure why the full recording was never released, but what we do have here is very fun. One thing I don't really like about this, though, is that on the disc itself, the tracks aren't separated, it's just one giant 45-minute track. It's set up this way on streaming services, too. But that's kind of a non-complaint, though, since whenever I put this on, I listen to it in its full entirety. Up next, I got their sophomore effort, Discovery. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, this is my favorite album of all time. I have a tradition of listening to it every New Year's Eve, and as such, I've listened to it a ton over the years. And it's never even remotely lost its luster. No album I've ever heard gets as strong a visceral reaction out of me as this one does. It's basically perfect in my eyes. There's tons of variety, yet it fits together as a whole very well. Every single track is memorable, well produced. Even on my most recent listen, I still notice little details that I never got before. It's also the perfect length at around an hour. The entire album is just perfect, pretty much. And I'm super glad it's as loved as it is. I know I'm not the only one who considers this their favorite album of all time. It's the definition of a timeless classic, and it's gonna stick with me for the rest of my life. I got their third album, Human After All. This one got a lot of mixed reviews upon its release, and I can see why. It feels much smaller scale than their previous albums, and their later albums too. If you hated it, I can understand why. I like it, but it is a pretty easy pick for a least favorite album of theirs. Not that there's a lot of choices to pick from. It's a good album. Great? No, but a good one. I got their second live album, Alive 2007. This is easily my favorite live album. Yeah, you notice a theme, Daft Punk, favorite of all time. It combines a whole bunch of tracks from their first 3 albums and mashes them up to fantastic effect. I don't put this one on all the time, but whenever I do, I'm pretty much blown away every time. It's an absolute ton of fun. Plus, there's little bits of new material sprinkled in there. I said in my Daft Punk tribute video that this is a, quote, absolutely exhilarating live album that I'm continuously blown away by, and I still stand by that. Up next, I got the Tron Legacy soundtrack. This one combines their synth-heavy electronic textures with some orchestral work, and the two mesh together quite well. Unsurprisingly, I do prefer the more electronic-leaning tracks here, but the orchestral ones are still very nice. I'd say of the orchestral pieces, my favorite is actually Rectifier for its dark and ominous tone, which contrasts with the rest of the project, and thus stands out more. Other highlights include Derezzed, of course. End of Line is also really catchy, and the end titles has this awesome acid house synth that runs throughout it. Also, this is one where I really like how the disc looks. I don't actually have a physical copy of Random Access Memories, though I unsurprisingly love that album too. I still have both of the Daft Punk t-shirts I showed in the original video. And I also still have the Daft Punk clock. As you can tell by the fact that the hands aren't moving, I use this more as a piece of decoration than anything. Still, this is really cool. Also, as a quick side note, I got this Gorillaz poster as a gift. I don't actually have anything from them physically, but I really like their stuff, especially their first 4 albums. Alright, up next, I got a few CDs from Canadian producer deadmau5. Starting with Random Album Title. This was his 3rd album and his breakthrough effort. He had 2 albums before this in Get Scraped and Vexillology. Get Scraped was really good, and Vexillology exists. I mean, there's like 2 or 3 cuts on there I like, but everything else is just kind of there. But anyway, Random Album Title is one of his best albums in my opinion. Fits together as a whole very well, and the continuous mix certainly helps with that. I enjoy all 12 of these tracks pretty much around the same amount. I think if you haven't heard anything from deadmau5, this would be a pretty good starting point. I got his next album, for lack of a better name. If you couldn't tell, deadmau5 isn't really great at naming his albums. But that's more of a nitpick than anything. This is another one of my favorites from him. Continuous mix isn't quite as smooth as the one on Random Album Title, but the individual tracks are more varied this time. My favorite tracks here include the first 3, 16th Hour and Strobe. All the other tracks are nice too, though. Let me open this one up. I didn't mention this before, but I do really like the mouse head design that he plasters all over everything he makes. The last deadmau5 album I own a physical copy of is... album title goes here. This one wins the award for worst album title that he has. Alright, it's not as big a deal as I'm making it out to be, but anyway, I'm getting off topic. This one doesn't have a continuous mix at all, actually, but that's probably a good thing, considering this album is pretty scattershot, doesn't really come together as a whole, but all the individual tracks are really good. And I'd say this is his most varied album to date. Once again, it's got several standout tracks, and even the weakest moments are still pretty nice. My favorite tracks here are Channel 42, The Veldt, Maths, There Might Be Coffee, and Sleepless is one of his most underrated tracks. I think out of all of his albums, this one best showcases his strengths as a producer. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is one of 2 things I own that has a lenticular album cover. It's got the mouse head combined with his cat Meowingtons. One more thing about this album that I didn't know until fairly recently is that it's actually a little shorter than the digital version, because if you don't know, CDs have an 80-minute time limit, and the original mixes of all the tracks combined total over that. So on the CD, they were slightly edited down. I don't actually mind that though. And that rounds out all the deadmau5 stuff I own. I kinda wish he would make another album. The last one that he made was in 2016, and he's mostly stuck to releasing singles since then. Though there was the album he did with Cascade under the name KX5 that came out fairly recently. If you want my thoughts on that project, it's decent. Admittedly more samey than I would have liked. It's definitely the most poppy project I've heard from deadmau5, but that's not inherently a bad thing. I don't think I like the album enough to keep it around in its whole entirety, but there are some good individual moments on there. Alright, let's get back to the CDs. I got Dimitri from Paris, Sakurai Bleu. This is actually the Japanese version that comes with the second disc of remixes and 3 tracks that he released under the name Dimitri from Tokyo. This is another one of my favorite albums. You might remember that I actually made a video breaking down all the samples used on the album a while back. It does make heavy use of samples, but uses them in a very creative way. This combines a couple of different genres of electronic music with some jazz influences. It also takes influences from movie soundtracks from the 60s and 70s. There's lots of variety, fits together as a whole, and has its own unique feel. Up next I have the one and only album from Duck Sauce, Quack. This is a really great disco house album. Admittedly, the songs here do rely fairly heavily on their samples, but they do enough to separate them from the originals. Not to mention, all these tracks link together well, and all the hooks are nailed. One thing about this album that I didn't like initially were the skits, as each track on here ends with a skit, and I found most of them to be pretty annoying. Though on my more recent listens, I warmed up to most of them. A few of them are still kind of annoying, but I'm cool with most of them now. Actually, there's one really funny one at the end of Barbra Streisand that's a Wu-Tang Clan parody. I don't think there's a single weak link on this album aside from maybe Goody Two Shoes, but that one's still nice, even if it is my least favorite. I'd say my two favorite tracks on here are Barbra Streisand, big surprise, and It's You. I have some good nostalgic memories attached to both of those cuts. Also, one more thing, as you guys can see, the artwork on this is pretty silly, but I like it. Next I have Eric Prydz presents Prida. I'll admit it's been a while since I've listened to this. The first disc has some new compositions, and the other two, as you can see, are retrospective mixes. Each disc does have its standout moments, and I like pretty much all the tracks on here. Some more than others, of course. Up next, I have some things from French producer Etienne de Crécy. Of course, starting with Super Discount. This was one of the first French house and, honestly, first electronic albums I remember finding. It's got a really unique feel to it. All the track names, except for one, are in French. And when translated, you'll see that they have names that are in line with the album's title. The first three cuts here have more energy to them, but everything else has a more chilled out, down-tempo-ish vibe. It's got some deep house influences too. Very smooth stuff. The fourth track is actually a remix of Air's Les Professionnels, from the above-mentioned Premier Symptoms EP. And the outro of Les Professionnels would later set the groundwork for their track All I Need from Moon Safari. This version of the track was my first exposure to Air. But this is very much a French house classic, even if it has a more chilled out vibe than most of the stuff you'll find in that genre. I got a second album, Tempo Vision. To date, this is the only one of his albums that's not called Super Discount. This one's definitely less laid back, has some more energy to it. And some of these tracks have actual lyrics and vocals on them, either sampled or studio contributions from singer Belita Woods. Personal enjoyment-wise, I think it's about on par with Super Discount, and it's got its own unique feel to it, which I always appreciate. Next up, I have Super Discount 2. Now, despite this album's title, this project marks a pretty big shift in sound for him. With this album, he moved away from the deep house, filter house, more chilled out vibe of the first two albums, and instead went for a harder hitting, electro, analog synth sound. Much heavier focus on electronic textures this time. Despite the major shift in sound, it's still no less enjoyable than his previous efforts. One thing that I think is interesting is that some of the tracks on here were named after peer-to-peer file sharing services like SoulSeek, LimeWire, Morphus, which does kind of carry the Super Discount name concept. I believe he said something like, it's not a discount, it's free. So I thought that was a nice touch. Like I said, this album does have a heavier focus on electronic textures, but the acoustic textures aren't gone entirely. For instance, the bass on Fast Track, and the acoustic guitar on Gifted, contributed by DJ Mehdi, rest in peace. Gifted actually stands out as a more chilled out moment. I also really like BitTorrent for its kind of spooky vibe. And other standouts include Audio Galaxy with its great bass line, and LimeWire for its hard-hitting beats. Overall, this is yet another winner from Etienne de Crécy. I don't actually have a copy of Super Discount 3. I really like that album as well, but it has no business being called Super Discount 3. None of the tracks have the same motifs that the ones on Super Discount 1 and 2 did. But regardless, still a great album too. As you guys can probably tell, Etienne de Crécy is another one of my favorite artists. He's remained very consistent throughout his 30-plus year music career. Not to mention, he was a key figure in forming the French house scene. In fact, the term French touch actually originated from a review of one of his records. But I digress. Next up, I got Fatboy Slim, You've Come a Long Way, Baby. This is easily my favorite Fatboy Slim album, although I haven't spent nearly as much time with the others as I have with this one. This was also the first big beat album I ever listened to. As you guys can see, this is the version that has the Wall of Records as the cover instead of the Fat Kid. This is another album that has an extensive yet impressive and creative use of samples. Most notable one in that department would be the Rockefeller Skank. A few of the cuts towards the middle aren't as interesting to me, like California and You're Not From Brighton, but those are still nice, and all the other tracks are great. I'd say I like the first half of the album more than the second, but regardless, this is a great album. Up next I got Fred Falk's Only Album, Part 4. This does lean a bit more towards being a compilation than an album, since most of the tracks on here were already released elsewhere. But regardless, all the cuts on here are really good. There's plenty of variety here and the grooves are all really nice. Next I have a really obscure one, Fresh Lab Jazzalistic. This is a really solid trip-hop / downtempo album. As you guys can see, some of these titles are a bit weird, like Urban Pygmies, Fishes Kept Laughin', and What a Fucking Day. Also, fitting with the title, some of these tracks do have a jazz tint to them, like the title track, obviously. Saxophone, you'll never guess what instrument is on that one. The only reason I found out Fresh Lab, and by extension this album exists, is because they contributed a track to a various artist compilation that I'll get to later. By the way, if you're wondering what's different between the Miles Da Flavor mix and the instrumental mix of the title track, the Miles Da Flavor mix has a trumpet, and the instrumental takes out the trumpet. Anyway, before I bought this, I only heard track 1 and track 3, as those were the only ones I could find on YouTube, and I liked what I heard, and I bought this hoping that the rest of the album would be about as good, and it was, so I'm quite happy with this. Next I have The Future Sound of London's Accelerator. Next I have The Future Sound of London's Accelerator. This is the USA version of Accelerator that came out on Hypnotic and has a bonus track. The original release of this album has a different cover that I'll show on the screen. This is also the first Future Sound of London album that I ever listened to. I got Giorgio Moroder's Midnight Express soundtrack. It's got his track Chase, which is one of my favorites from him. I also really like both versions of the title track. The other tracks aren't as good, but they're still nice. Next I have Grand Popo Football Club, Shampoo Victims. As you guys can tell, this is not at all a serious album, but it is a very fun one. Gotta love these track titles, like Each Finger Has an Attitude, Men Are Not Nice Guys, One More Song on the Market. Nothing to Say in a House Song is a parody of house tracks where the only vocal is repeating the title. And there's also Yo Quiero Más Dinero, which translates to I Want More Money. Goofy track titles and album cover aside, this album is a lot of fun. It was on streaming services, but it did get taken down, so that's why I have a physical copy here. Next I got Hybrid's Wide Angle. This is the reissue double disc album retitled Wider Angle and has the alternate album art. Next I have Ian Pooley, Since Then. The version I own for some reason removes the track Spicy Snapper. Also, this version has a hidden track at the very end that's just an interview. Up next I have Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen, or Oxygen, however you want to pronounce it. Now, this has definitely stood the test of time. It was Jarre's breakthrough album. It came out in late 1976. And like I said, it still sounds great even today. And that's not even to get into how monumental and influential it's been over the years. Next, I got Jeff Mills' Waveform Transmission Volume 3. This is a nice little Detroit techno album. Next, I have Justice's Cross. This is a really fun French electro album. I still don't really care for the party, or the party if you're a normal person. And a few of these tracks do end abruptly, but aside from that, this album's great. I do also like Justice's other two albums, but this is still easily my favorite from them. Next I have Kavinsky's Outrun, which actually turns 10 this year. Actually, it already has. This is another great album. The intro and outro have a cool cinematic vibe thanks to the narration. There's also his big hit Night Call, and the deep cuts are really good too. There's a track called Rampage that samples the Dragon Ball Z soundtrack of all things, and works surprisingly well. There's also Suburbia, which has some rap elements. Most of the tracks on here were co-produced by Sebastian, and his influence definitely shines through, given its rough and distorted, heavy-hitting electro sound. But regardless, very solid stuff here. Next I have Kid Loco, A Grand Love Story. This is the reissue that has a second disc of B-sides. Actually, the track The Wrong Number was the first song I heard from him. Of course, I liked it enough to where it compelled me to look into more of his stuff. This one is on streaming services, but the version on there is different. That version has several alternate mixes of tracks, presumably due to sample clearance issues. I do prefer this original version, but either way, this is one of my favorite trip-hop / downtempo albums. I got Chris Menace's Idiosyncrasies. This is another 3-disc set. The first 2 contain original material, while the third one contains remixes. Of these, the first one is easily my favorite. The second disc doesn't grab my attention quite as much as the first, but it's still nice. All the tracks on the first one are great, except for Scalar, which is kinda lame and gimmicky to me. The Chemical Brothers have a similarly titled track that they released as a B-side that has the same core idea, but is just way more fun to listen to. But like I said, the rest of the cuts on the first disc are great. I'd say my favorite track on here is probably Lumberjack. That one's super propulsive and a ton of fun to listen to. Next I have the one and only album from the short-lived duo Majo, self-titled. This is another favorite of mine. It's a really nice disco house album. Most of the cuts on here feature actual vocals and lyrics, though there are a few instrumental cuts, like Music Takes You Back is mostly an instrumental outside of one line, and Roller Coaster is also an instrumental. The album starts and ends on a more chill note, but there's also some more energetic moments like Chillin', Lady, Music Takes You Back, and On Fire. But yeah. Next up I have Motorbass, Pansol. This is actually the reissue that has the second disc of early works. I bought this before the album actually got put on streaming services. But as for the album itself, it has a cool, quiet, nighttime vibe to it. Some tracks on here have more defined grooves, such as Flying Fingers and Neptune, whereas other ones are more low-key, like Fabulous, Off, and Bad Vibes. I often see this album credited as a stepping stone in the French Touch movement, and I can definitely see why. I'd be lying if I said I thought the album was fantastic, but it is very good. Next I have another relatively obscure one with Mozesli, or however you pronounce that. This is another trip-hop album, though it explores a wide variety of sounds, and it has a lot of instrumental muscle. Also, there's 2 tracks on here that have French rapping. I also really like the artwork on this one. I bought this having only heard 3 tracks, and the rest of the album did not disappoint. I very much consider this a hidden gem. Speaking of hidden gems, I got Mr. Flash's debut album, Sonic Crusader. If you're a longtime viewer, then you'll know that I'm a big fan of Mr. Flash. I've mentioned him in several other videos I've made in the past. Unfortunately, he hasn't done much since this album. He did tease a comeback in 2021, I believe, but nothing's materialized from that, at least as of yet. But anyway, this album is superb. Open it up. Next up, I have Mr. Wazo's Lamb's Anger. This was released on Ed Banger Records, as was the last album I just showed you. This is easily my favorite album from Mr. Wazo. I wouldn't say Mr. Wazo is the most consistent artist. He has put out some material that I found to be pretty uninteresting. But like I said, this album is easily his best work. And if you haven't heard anything from him, I'd say this would be the best jumping on point. There is one track here I don't really like, being the title track, though it's not that bad. It's basically just 1 minute of atonal clicking and beeping sounds. Everything else, though, is really good. Next, I have The Natural by Nicolas Vallet. I believe that's how you say that. This is a relatively obscure French house album from 2002, and it's yet another one that I consider a hidden gem. If you're into that style like I am, then I'd definitely recommend giving this a shot. Next, I have Orbital's Green Album. This is the US version that has a significantly different track listing. I have the original UK version saved on my Spotify. Between the two, I definitely prefer how the UK version is sequenced. For instance, this version puts Belfast at the beginning instead of at the end, which doesn't really make sense to me. It feels more like a closer than an opener. But this version does have some cool cuts not on the UK version, like Satan, Choice, and the 8-minute version of Chime. This is not one of my favorite Orbital albums. I think their second album is much stronger than this one, but this one's still good. Next, I have Oh Why. I got this as a bonus from a Discogs seller when I bought something else in my collection. This is a pretty neat African-influenced album. It's got some electronic, pop, and experimental flares to it too. Up next I have Pepe Braddock with Santhes. This is a very nice collection of deep house and filter house material. There's also some down-tempo and experimental cuts. Unfortunately, most of what Pepe Braddock has put out is on vinyl only. Also, this CD version is missing a track not on the vinyl edition, that being Hips. Which is too bad, but what are you gonna do? Next, I have a handful of CDs from Pink Floyd, starting with Metal. This project marks as a transition between the experimental early period and the mid-70s Roger Waters-driven period. My favorite track on here is actually not Echoes, although that one's still really nice, but instead my favorite is the opener, One of These Days. It's a dark and hard-hitting instrumental cut. Next I have Dark Side of the Moon, and it held up pretty well on my most recent listen. I can definitely see why this is one of the best-selling albums of all time. As basic of a pick as it may be, I'd say it's my favorite album from them. Next we got Wish You Were Here. Really like the artwork on this one. And then finally I got The Wall, the rock opera classic and Roger Waters' magnum opus. And I also have one more rock CD in my collection, being Queen's Greatest Hits. Don't really need to say anything about this one. Next I have the debut album from Reminiscence Quartet. This is a cool acid jazz project that was led by Bob Sinclair. I don't have much to say about it, but I like it. Up next I have Rhinoceros, or Rhinoceros, however you pronounce that. Music Kills Me. This is their third album. I have their first two saved on Spotify. This band mixes together the rhythmic structures of house music with the sound palette of rock music. You know, a lot of electric guitars and stuff like that. Though this album here also has some disco influences. Next I have Roy Davis Jr.'s Sol Electrica. This is a really nice compilation. It has Rock Shock, which was the first track I ever heard of his, thanks to being released on the Roulette label. That one's still one of my favorite tracks from him. Other highlights here include Party Here, I Wanna See Your Body Move, All I Do, and Lyrical Trip. But all of these tracks are pretty close together in terms of quality and my own personal enjoyment. Next I have Sebastian's first album, Total. This is another thing on the Ed Banger Records label. This is a really fun collection of blown out electro tunes. I imagine an album like this may be overwhelming for some, and this certainly isn't something I'd want to listen to all the time, but whenever I put this on, I always have a lot of fun with it. I also really like how this album flows. Up next we got Sedat, the Turkish Avenger single. This is the only Crydomore single I own, actually. Most of the Crydomore singles are vinyl only, but there were a handful that were released on CD, and this is one of them. The CD versions are pretty hard to come by, so I do feel kind of lucky that I was able to snag a copy of this. It also has his track Feel Inside, which isn't on either of the Waves compilations I showed you earlier. Up next I got an unofficial thing, Skrillex's Greatest Hits and Remixes. Before I had a subscription to Spotify, I was gonna get physical copies of his Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites EP, as well as his Bangarang EP, though I found this on Amazon and I opted to get this instead since it has more content. Though, now that I do have a Spotify subscription, I have both of those EPs saved and I'd rather return to those in their original form than listen to the tracks on this unofficial CD. Also, this comp is missing Summit from the Bangarang EP, which is a shame because that's one of the best tracks on there. But I did get some use out of this. Up next I have Spiller's Crybaby single. This is a great funky house single. It's not a super well known one, so I'd recommend looking it up if you're curious. Up next I have another single that's significantly more well known. Stardust's Music Sounds Better With You. I don't really have to say anything about this one. It's a classic. It also has a really nice remix from Dimitri from Paris. Next I have Saint Germain's Tourist album. This blends together house and jazz to very enjoyable effect. There's also some other genre flares thrown in here, like the second track has some dub influence. Next I have Superfunk's only album, Hold Up. This is the version that takes out the title track and replaces it with Last Dance and I Come Over. I don't really mind that though, I have the title track saved separately on Spotify. I talked about this album in a previous video, so if you want to hear my thoughts on it, check that out. Next I have The Crystal Method, Tweekend. This is an advanced promo copy. Has a few differences from the final album version. Next I have The Eternals with the Astro Pioneer soundtrack. This is a soundtrack to a movie that doesn't exist. Of course, I discovered The Eternals through their Wrath of Zeus single that they released on the Crytomore label. The stuff on here isn't that far off stylistically from the Wrath of Zeus single, though it has more of a focus on electronic textures and original compositions rather than samples. Regardless, this is really solid stuff. Next I have The Mighty Bop. If you don't know, The Mighty Bop was a trip-hop outfit led by Bob Sinclair. Actually, he started this one before he started releasing music under the Bob Sinclair name. But this is really nice. It's got a dark and mysterious atmosphere most of the time, though there are a few more lighthearted cuts. But yeah, very nice album. I also have the album they came out with a year afterwards, Ultra Voix Ultra Bleu. I'm not French if you couldn't tell. Anyway, this one's also very solid. I do like the previous album more, but this one is still lots of fun. There was one more Mighty Bop album after that, a self-titled one that moved into a more jazz-focused and lighthearted sound. I have that one saved on my Spotify since it's the only one that is on Spotify, other than a Spin My Hits compilation. Anyway, next up I have Thomas Bangalter's Irreversible soundtrack. Of course, Thomas was one half of Daft Punk. I have not seen this movie, and I doubt I ever will. I know about some of the things that happen in it, and the movie doesn't really sound like my thing. But anyway, this soundtrack is great. It has a few tracks previously released on the Tracks on the Rocks EPs, as well as some new compositions that appropriately have a darker tone to them. Of the new compositions, Paris by Night is easily my favorite. I really like the chord progression on that one, as well as the instrumental textures, especially that 8-bit bleeping synth. Speaking of Thomas Bangalter, I also have the So Much Love to Give Together single. Together was the duo of him and fellow producer DJ Falcon. This disc only has the one track and nothing else on it, unfortunately, but the one track is over 10 minutes long, so I don't mind. Alright, coming up next I have a whole bunch of various artist compilations. To start, we have A Finest Fusion of Black Tempo. I believe this was the first release on the Yellow Productions label. This project combines hip-hop and jazz very appealingly. Next I have Bassnautics Guest List. This is a compilation of tracks on the Bassnautics label. Most of the Bassnautics tracks were vinyl only, so this is nice to have. I got Blake and Mortimer, electronic grooves inspired by the legendary comic strip heroes. Actually, I think that should say grooves, not groove. Gotta be honest, I never heard of Blake and Mortimer before I bought this. The reason I did get this is because I heard 3 of the tracks online and I liked what I heard. So of course I bought this because I wanted to hear the rest. Next I have Conversations with the French Connection. This is pretty much a spiritual successor to Finest Fusion. You can copy what I said about that one and put it here. Next up I have Edrec Volume 2. This version has a bonus track, which is pretty cool. If you haven't heard anything on the Ed Banger label, I'd say this is a good showcase of what their sound was like in their earlier days. And by that I mean the first 5 years of their existence. I also really like the artwork on this one. I also have the follow-up, Edrec Volume 3. I think I like this one a bit better than the first one, or the second one rather. Next I have Edrec Volume 10. What happened to Volumes 4 through 9? Jokes aside, this one is also very nice. Can you guys even see that text? It's very dark. Oh well. I have the one that followed that, Edrec 100, saved on my Spotify. That one's a fair bit spottier than the previous ones, but still has plenty of great material. Next I have French Fried Funk Volume 2. The name of this one, combined with the yellow aesthetic, makes me think of French fries. Next up, I got Future Sound of Paris 2, The City Returns. This is a really nice collection of French house material. There's 2 down-tempo cuts thrown in the mix too. Next up, I have La Yellow 357. Like with Astro Pioneers, this is marked as a soundtrack to a movie, and said movie does not exist. Anyway, this has more Mighty Bop tracks on it, as well as contributions from Dimitri from Paris, DJ Cam, and it's got that fresh live track I mentioned earlier. I'm going to open up the booklet for this one too, because there's something in it that I think is kind of funny. Up top, you can see it says, an original soundtrack recording composed of music with repetitive beats. That's one way to put it. I got the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever. This is the soundtrack to a movie that does exist. You can see it has the price tag of $10 on it, which is how much I paid for this. I got this at a record store and not online. In retrospect, $10 is pretty pricey for this, especially for something that's as widely available as this. The BG tracks on here are unsurprising favorites, though other highlights here include A Fifth of Beethoven, Manhattan Skyline, Disco Inferno, and Night on Disco Mountain. Actually, Night on Disco Mountain was sampled on Justice's Stress, which appeared on their Cross album that I showed you earlier. Next I have Source Lab 3. Of the various artist compilations I have, this one is my favorite. This one's actually split into 2 parts, 3X and 3Y. Between the two, I like 3Y a little more, but both are great. Some of the highlights here include Faithful, which is a fantastic Filter House track, Paris Acid City, which as you may guess is a really nice acid house track, and there's also the track Air did with Jean-Jacques Perry, Cosmic Bird, which is incredible. It would have fit pretty well on Moon Safari as an album closer if Les Voyages de Penelope wasn't on there. Next I have Vulture Music, mixed by Alan Brax. This is pretty much the Cry-to-More Waves equivalent to Vulture Music. In other words, this is a mixed compilation of various tracks on the label. It's got a bunch of the most popular ones like Intro and Discopolis. There's also a few exclusive cuts thrown in the bunch like Haze and Automatic. This is another one that has very nice artwork, although I'm not really sure what's up with the whole diagonal barcode thing. I got What's Up Mix It, Mo DJs Volume 2. And I also have the sequel to that, What's Up Mix It, Mo DJs Volume 3. And the last various artist compilations I have is Work It Baby 10th Anniversary. This is a 2-disc set. The first contains then exclusive cuts, and the second one contains previously released cuts. I say then exclusive because since the release of this comp, some of the exclusive tracks were released elsewhere. Next I have the We in Music Grand Life single. This is a fantastic house track. Reminds me of some of the big French touch singles like Majo's Lady, Stardust's Music Sounds Better With You, etc. Personal enjoyment-wise, it's on par with those. I also really like the 2 remixes. Next I have Wolfgang Gartner, Weekend in America. It's been a long time since I've listened to this. I remember it kind of being a mixed bag, but it definitely had its moments. Next I have Zend Avesta vs. Extra Lucid, Combat Rock EP. This is a really cool jungle / drum and bass EP. I bought this having only heard 2 tracks on it, those being Frisia and Technical Jed. I liked what I heard, so I bought this wanting to hear the rest. Frisia is definitely my favorite track on here, though the rest of the EP is quite enjoyable. I also really like the warm instrumental textures of Alvin Sinatra. I also have another EP from Zend Avesta, being Queen of Siam, or Siam. And for the last CD in my collection, I have something that's pretty unlike the others. This is the soundtrack to an anime called Genkutsuo the Count of Monte Cristo. As you may guess, it's a loose adaptation of The Count of Monte Cristo, where they put a whole futuristic spin on everything. It sounds pretty weird on paper, but honestly, it's one of the best anime I've ever watched. And one of the reasons why I like it so much is the soundtrack, which I have here, of course. Even excluding the opening and ending themes, there are several standout tracks. I really like their dramatic piano piece Prologue, and the playful romance-laden Waltz. Honestly, the whole soundtrack is very nice, even divorced from the context of the show. It also came with this small sticker sheet. And that wraps up my CD collection. Of course, what I showed you isn't all the music I listen to. I have way more things saved on Spotify. I also stream music on SoundCloud and Bandcamp. You can find the links to my SoundCloud page and my Bandcamp fan page in the description. On my Bandcamp fan page, I write comments for everything I buy. And you can also find my own music on SoundCloud and my Bandcamp artist page. One more thing I want to say before I close the video is that I've added all my CDs to my collection on Discogs. If you want to see what I purchase in the future, and a continuously up-to-date CD collection, you can find that in the description as well. And that's about it.